You know, people often say that power is something you wear on your sleeve or carry in a holster. But after 20 years in law enforcement, I've realized that real power is actually the ability to stay completely still while the world screams in your face. It was a Tuesday evening, just one of those heavy, humid Maryland nights where the air feels like a wet blanket, and all I wanted, literally the only thing on my mind, was getting some flank steak and a gallon of milk home before my kids started a mutiny. I just finished a grueling 12-hour shift as the commander of the 4th District, dealing with everything from budget cuts to departmental politics. And I was still in my civilian clothes, just a tired guy in a faded hoodie and jeans looking for the shortest checkout line. I didn't know that within the next 20 minutes, my own neighborhood's self-appointed, in quote, queen of the cul-de-sac, in quote, was on trying to dismantle my entire life over a bag of groceries. And honestly, looking back at it now, I almost feel sorry for how badly she miscalculated the person standing in front of her. The store was packed, and by the time I finally pushed my cart out into the parking lot, the sun was doing that long, orange dip below the horizon, casting these weird, distorted shadows across the asphalt. I was balancing a heavy paper bag in one arm, the kind where you can feel the condensation from the milk carton starting to soak through the bottom, and I was fumbling for my keys when this shadow just stepped into my path. I almost walked right into him, and when I looked up, I saw this kid, maybe 18 years old, wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my first car, and he was just standing there with his chest puffed out like he was auditioning for a low-budget gangster flick. He didn't say hello, didn't an oppose. T asked for help. He just looked at my grocery bag and then looked at me with this chilling, unearned confidence and said, and quote, "Hey, hand it over, man. Those groceries just give an oppose. Empty me right now," end quote. I actually laughed. I really did, because I thought I was being pranked for one of those social media videos where people do ridiculous things for views, but the kid's face didn't twitch, and his eyes had this flat, entitled vacuum behind them that made my internal alarm bells start ringing. I've stared down armed suspects and handled domestic disputes that would make your skin crawl. So a teenager trying to tax my dinner wasn't oppose. Exactly terrifying, but the sheer audacity of it was what stopped me cold. I just gripped the bag a little tighter and told him, and quote, "Look, kid, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but these are paid for and I'm tired, so why don't you move along before this gets weird?" End quote. But he didn't oppose. Move. He just smirked, and that's when I heard the clicking of heels on the pavement behind him, the unmistakable sound of reinforcements arriving in the form of Diane Sterling. Now, you have to understand who Diane is to understand why this escalated so fast. She's the vice president of our homeowners association, a woman who treats the neighborhood bylaws like the 10 Commandments and has personally fined me twice for having a, end quote, non-compliant, end quote, mailbox color. She's the kind of person who spends her Saturdays measuring the height of people's fescue grass with a literal ruler. And as she stepped up beside her son, placing a protective hand on his shoulder, I saw that familiar look of aristocratic disdain wash over her face. She didn't oppose to even look at the situation. She just looked at me, the guy in the hoodie who she'd only ever seen from a distance or through a Ring camera, and she snapped, and quote, "Marcus told you to give him the bag, so why are you making this difficult for us?" End quote. I felt this cold ripple of realization go down my spine because it wasn't an oppose, a joke anymore. She actually believed, in her twisted, gated community logic, that she could just demand my property because she didn't oppose. Recognized me, or because I didn't oppose. Fit the, end quote, aesthetic, end quote, of her perfect neighborhood that evening. I stood my ground, my voice dropping into that low, controlled tone I use when a scene is about to turn tactical, and I said, end quote, "Diane, it's me, Greg from 3 streets over, and your son is currently attempting to rob me in broad daylight. I suggest you take him home before this goes on the record." End quote. But she didn't oppose to even blink at my name. She just scoffed and looked around at the few shoppers who were starting to stop and stare, and she raised her voice, intentionally loud, shouting, end quote, "This man is harassing my son. He's trying to steal our groceries, and he's threatening a minor," end quote. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, honestly, and Marcus, seeing his mom go into full performance mode, started playing the victim, backing away with his hands up, yelling about how I was, end quote, acting crazy, end quote, and, end quote, making him feel unsafe, end quote, People were pulling out their phones, recording us, and I could see the narrative shifting in real time as these strangers looked at me. A large guy in a hoodie, and then at this well-dressed woman and her, end quote. Scared, end quote. Son. Diane saw she had an audience, and that's when a mask really slipped. She leaned in close, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper that only I could hear, and she said, end quote, "You people think you can just move into a place like this and act like you and Oppos. Re-equal to us, but you're just a guest here, and today your stay is over." End quote. Then, with a flourish that belonged on a soap opera, she pulled out her iPhone and dialed 911, screaming into the receiver that an, end quote, aggressive, unidentified male, end quote, was attacking her family in the parking lot. I didn't in Oppos. Move an inch. I just leaned against the side of my truck and watched her, and there was this strange, surreal silence in my head while she paced back and forth, lying to the dispatcher with such fluid, practiced ease that it was almost impressive. She was describing me as, end quote, unhinged, end quote, and, end quote, looming, end quote, claiming I had a concealed weapon while I was literally just holding a bag containing a head of lettuce and some yogurt. Marcus was standing there smirking at me, mocking me with his eyes because he thought he was about to watch a man get ruined. And for a second, I thought about the irony of it all. How many times I'd sat in the precinct and heard stories about people weaponizing the police, and now I was the target of the very system I'd spent 25 years leading. The siren started low and then grew into that piercing, rhythmic wail that cuts through everything, and 3 patrol cars screeched into the lot, flanking my truck and cutting off any exit. I knew the officers before they even opened their doors. It was Miller and Henderson, 2 guys I'd mentored since they were rookies, and I saw the exact moment they stepped out and their eyes locked onto me. Diane didn't end Oppos. Wait for them to approach. She ran toward them, her voice cracking in a fake sob, pointing her finger at me like a bayonet, crying out, end quote, "That in Oppos. Him. He tried to mug my son. He's dangerous. You need to tackle him. He has something in his pocket." End quote. Marcus was right behind her, nodding frantically, adding, end quote, "Yeah, he tried to grab me. I thought he was going to kill us." End quote. Miller and Henderson stopped dead in their tracks, and the look on their faces was something I'll never forget. It was this perfect mixture of absolute confusion and mounting horror as they looked at the woman screaming for an arrest, and then at their district commander standing there with a grocery bag. The crowd was hushed, phones were out, everyone waiting for the takedown, and Diane was practically vibrating with triumph, waiting for the handcuffs to come out. Miller took a step forward, his hand nowhere near his belt, and he looked at me, then back at Diane, and he said, end quote, "Mon Oppos. You're telling us this man, this specific man, tried to rob you?" End quote. And she shrieked, end quote, "Yes. Are you deaf? Arrest him. He's a threat to the community." End quote. I finally spoke up, my voice calm and carrying that weight of command that you can in Oppos. Fake. And I said, end quote, "Evening, Miller. Henderson. Sorry you had to come out for this, but I think Mrs. Sterling here has a statement she'd like to officially sign regarding the attempted and Oppos, robbery and Oppos, she just witnessed." End quote. The silence that followed was so thick you could have chewed on it. Diane's head snapped toward me, her brow furrowed, and she stammered, end quote, "How? How do you know their names?" End quote. And Henderson, who's never been one for subtlety, just looked at her with pure disgust and said, end quote, "Mind Oppos. You just called the police to report a crime committed by the man who runs the entire police department for this district. This is Commander Harrison." End quote. The color didn't end Oppos. Just leave Diane and Oppos' face. It was like her entire soul just evaporated through her pores, leaving behind this hollow, gray shell of a woman who suddenly realized she'd just committed a felony in front of a dozen witnesses and her own son. Marcus looked like he wanted to melt into the pavement, his, end quote, tough guy, end quote, act replaced by the shivering realization that he'd just tried to shake down the one person in the zip code you absolutely never mess with. I walked over to them, the grocery bag still in my arm, and I looked Diane right in the eyes. No anger, just a deep, weary disappointment. And I told her, end quote, "You wanted the police, Diane. Well, they're here. And since you spent the last 10 minutes filing a false report, claiming I was armed, and accusing me of a violent felony, I think it's only fair that we follow the law to the letter, Don and Oppos. To you? End quote. I didn't and Oppos. T let them off with a warning. I couldn't and Oppos. T, because if I had been anyone else, if I hadn't and Oppos, T been the commander. That night could have ended in a tragedy for an innocent man just because of her prejudice and her son and Oppos as entitlement. I watched as Miller and Henderson took their formal statements, and I made sure every single witness who was recording on their phone stayed to give their contact info, ensuring that Diane couldn't and Oppos. T wiggle out of the end quote. False report end quote. Charge that was coming her way. As I loaded my groceries into my truck and started the engine, I saw her sitting on the curb, her head in her hands, while the neighbors she'd bullied for years stood around whispering and pointing, and I realized that sometimes the best way to handle a bully is in and Oppos. T to shout louder. In Oppos. That's just to let them keep talking until they in Oppos. V hung themselves with their own words. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. What if I hadn't and Oppos? T been the commander? What if I was just a guy who didn't and Oppos? T have a badge or a title to protect me? We live in a world where a bag of groceries and a bad attitude from the wrong person can change your life in a heartbeat. And it makes me wonder how many people out there are sitting in a cell right now because A and quote, Diane and quote, decided they didn't and Oppos, T belong. I'm curious to know what you guys think. Did I go too hard on her by pushing for the charges? Or was that the only way to make sure she never weaponized the 911 system again? Have you ever had a run-in with someone who thought their status gave them the right to your property or your peace of mind? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because this neighborhood is supposed to be for everyone, but as I learned that Tuesday, some people are still trying to keep the gates closed. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories from the front lines of the thin blue line. Stay safe out there and watch out for the Dines of the world.